I'm working on a couple of hugelkultur berms, and I've got a couple ponds that I'll be digging out next week, so I wanted to get the wood in place. Now I've got free soil that's coming out of the pond. However, I did not have any wood, so I ended up having to get some wood from a firewood company, and they actually were able to provide me some wood that they weren't going to use for burning. He said he claimed they were treetops, but so I got a little bit of a discounted price on this stuff. Usually my biggest problem with the hugelkultur is the soil. The amount of soil you need is what really makes it expensive, not so much the wood. So I was willing to buy in the wood, given that I was going to have tons and tons of soil for free. Also, I wouldn't have to pay to haul the soil off site if I didn't have a place for it. So anyway, so the problem with these treetops is they're pretty heavy. So the first thing that I had to do was I started to try to move it by tractor, but to be honest with you, it really wasn't very easy to move with the tractor. It just took longer. It was almost easier to move by hand, even though these pieces are relatively heavy. So when you're doing hugelkultur, you really don't want more than, say, 25 to 35% wood to soil. So if you can imagine these berms, with about 25% more, 25% or 75% more soil on top of here. So with hugelkultur, you really want 25 to 35% wood, and then 65, 70% or so is going to be the soil. So you see the size of this of the wood that I've piled up here, so you can imagine that the berms are probably going to be more or less right about here. So you're talking 4 feet or so, 4.5 feet maybe. The other problem with this wood is it's green. I mean, it's relatively fresh cut. So initially, I'll have some issues with the nitrogen. These beds are more of a long-term deal. So initially, they probably won't be great grow beds, but I'm going to add some compost. I'm going to dress it with compost. So I'll do the subsoil that I'm getting out of the pond, then I'll add some compost. And I'm planning to do everything by seed. So I've got a lot of seedlings, or a lot of seed that you can plant in the fall that will overwinter and then sprout in the spring. So the idea is we'll put the soil, subsoil, and then we'll do, if we've got any, whatever topsoil we get, then we'll do the topsoil, and then we'll do the compost. And I'm thinking of using a seed mat and spiking that stuff down to hold all the seed in place, because otherwise it's just going to wash off the side. One issue you want to be a little bit concerned about with hugelkultur is, as you can see, I've got both these hugelkultur berms placed out on contour. If you have a steep slope and you're putting all your hugelkultur beds on contour, you could conceivably run into a situation where the water has no place to go and you're causing a mudslide, basically. So in my situation here, it's not really a particularly steep grade, and I've only got 2 of them. So I'm not concerned about it in this application. These are the 2 hugelkultur beds where we're placing all the soil that came out of the pond. We've got a little bit more soil to add here, and then they'll be ready for compost. I'm going to dress these up with about 3 or 4 inches of compost on the top. with the tractor I can get the compost and the subsoil applied over the wood in these hugelkultur beds relatively even, but it still requires a little bit of hand raking. I really didn't bother to hand rake the subsoil just because I knew I was going to be applying a pretty thick layer of compost to kind of even it out, and it was pretty, and the subsoil was pretty even. This is just kind of like a good final raking to make it look nice and neat, dress it up, make it nice and even. Now, I guess technically you could conceivably leave it like this, in which case you'd end up with a little bit more lumpy texture, which could actually give you a few more microclimates, but I guess it's still the landscaper in me that wants to make everything look kind of neat. But anyway, so it doesn't take real long just to kind of rake it so it's nice and even. You know, cover up all the gaps in the subsoil. The thing about hugelkultur is, if I were to just leave the subsoil and not put any compost over top, which could conceivably be done, however, you don't have a very good medium for anything to grow in, any sort of seed, any plants, and I guarantee you the stuff that would end up growing here would probably be things that you wouldn't be super excited about. So there's a couple ways you can do this. I know a lot of guys will carefully remove the the humus layer and the topsoil from the area of the hugelkultur before putting the wood in, and then they put the wood in down underneath, and then you put all the subsoil, and then you save the humus layer aside, and then you put it back, and then you seed into that. The problem with that is the surface area. For example, for me, I mean, unless you've got really, really deep topsoil, which on this sloped, degraded hill, I'm building topsoil, but I really don't have tremendously deep, wonderful topsoil. It's getting better, but it's not necessarily the best, especially when we're still on this slope. Now down there in the bottomlands, it's certainly much better. But so if you think about it, if I were to do that, scrape carefully, the surface area on this is much bigger. This side and the other side is at least, I would say, a good 2 times the surface area of what we're digging on the bottom. So I don't know that the amount of time and effort of trying to save that stuff is worth the effort in conjunction with just buying in the compost and bringing it in, which is much easier. The other thing is the compost is not going to be filled with weeds. So you put in your subsoil and your humus layer, and you set that aside. You spend all that time and effort doing that, and then what you end up with is a bunch of stuff growing. There might be some stuff growing that you like, but you're not going to be choosing all the plants that you want to grow in your hugelkultur berm. And if you spend all this time, effort, and material on building a hugelkultur berm, you want to put some stuff in that you really want. So we're talking some little bit higher value food, medicinal type crops. The hugelkultur berms are now ready to be seeded.